Hello again. At long last, the system of quotas which limit the number of students belonging to certain ethnicities, which have been operated for decades at some American universities, have been declared unlawful. This will be excellent news for Asian Americans, for the chief purpose of the exercise, sometimes known as affirmative action, has been to deny them places in higher education. The problem is, you see, that people of East Asian ancestry tend to do much better than black people and white when it comes to academic achievement. So it was that cunning schemes have been devised to make sure that those of Chinese heritage are denied places, and those places instead given to black people who would not otherwise achieve highly enough academically to gain places at Harvard, Yale and other Ivy League colleges. The only way to get them in is to rig the admissions process, and this will no longer be happening. Abandoning affirmative action, quotas, racial balancing and all the rest of it will present a problem, of course. This is that the number of black people in medical schools at the most academic universities in certain professions and roles will, as time passes, inexorably decline. Contemporaneously with this trend, the proportion of people whose families are East Asian in origin will rise in those settings. Very few black people will be getting into the more academic universities or medical schools on their own merits. They simply do not tend to score highly enough on admissions tests. So it is that the universities fiddle the process to get them in by ditching academic requirements and using personality tests to decide who they will admit. This is sometimes known as racial balancing. Harvard was caught out at this game a few years ago, and of course it's going on in Britain as well, where it began about 20 years ago. Take the case of the University of Birmingham Medical School. In the late 1990s, the then British government suggested it would be a good thing if more people from what were described as non-traditional groups should somehow be encouraged to enter higher education. That is to say, staying on after the age of 18 and going to university. This initiative was known as widening participation. The medical school in Birmingham joined enthusiastically into this programme by greatly expanding the number of students recruited for their 5-year course. This was following recommendations from the Medical Workforce Standing Advisory Committee in 1997, which suggested that medical schools should, and I quote, seek to attract an increasing number of students from local, socially deprived areas. At Birmingham University's medical school in 1992 to 1993, a small percentage of medical students, just 6%, failed at least one of the examinations which they took. To put this another way, 94% of students sailed through the course without failing any of their examinations. 10 years later, in the year 2002-2003, the percentage of medical students at Birmingham failing at least one of their examinations had soared to 48%. In other words, from 94% of students passing all their examinations, within a decade only about half of them were doing so. Something which staff at the university noticed was that although just 25% of students on the course were of South Asian origin, they made up a hugely disproportionate number of those failing their first-year examinations. It was quite an embarrassing observation. Clearly something was going wrong with the widening participation at the medical school. American readers, viewers by the way, might find this a little puzzling at first sight. In the United States, Asian is generally used to indicate people from East Asia, Chinese, Koreans and so on. In Britain, Asian means somebody from South Asia, specifically the Indian subcontinent. Some members of communities from this part of the world, especially those whose families have their origins in Pakistan, underachieve at school. It will be recalled that since over half of school children of Pakistani heritage are the product of cousin marriages, the incidence of genetic birth defects is 10 times that of the white British community. Academic underachievement in this group is widespread, and according to a survey of children in English schools in 2011, profound multiple learning difficulties are more common among Pakistani and Bangladeshi children. Although the idea of elitism has fallen rather into disrepute in Britain these days, it served a very useful purpose when choosing who should be admitted to medical schools. By restricting the number of available places and forcing applicants to fight fiercely if they wished to secure a place on the course, it was ensured that those who ended up in medical school were there because they truly wished to study medicine. They had not chosen to become doctors just because it was a respectable career or because their relatives had urged them to become doctors for the prestige which it might lend to the family. Unfortunately, when courses were made more widely available, this is precisely the kind of thing which had happened, especially among ethnic minorities. Rather than a vocation to which they were passionately devoted, medicine became seen as just another career option which might lead to a good standard of living. This is a situation which faced Birmingham. Studying medicine is a very taxing business, more so than qualifying as an accountant or solicitor. Unless one is prepared to devote oneself to the process, rather than viewing it as just another university course, then the chances of failing are high. By opening up the course and creating more places, all that had been achieved was gaining students who were not up to the required standard in various ways. The medical school at Birmingham University doesn't appear to have learned anything in the 20 years or so since they began to see the ill effects of the policy of widening access. According to their website, in March 2021, they're still resolutely pursuing the same course by means of what they call, in common with many other universities, contextual offers. This essentially means that ethnic minorities and working class school pupils are given special preference when decisions are made about whom to interview and admit. Because it is thought to be a good and desirable thing in itself that those studying medicine should reflect the community from which they are drawn as a whole, ways have to be devised by universities to ensure that more members of visible minorities, together with working class students, instead of those from the white middle classes, are recruited. To do this, one begins lowering the qualifications needed to get onto courses. By analysing the postcode of those who apply, using either a system called Acorn or another known as Polar, it's possible to spot those who live in poor districts and even identify individual streets in which few older adults have been to university. The schools which applicants have attended are also scrutinised, and if few pupils did well at A-levels or go to places such as Oxford or Cambridge universities, this is another positive mark. Because black people and certain other visible minorities, those whose families are from Pakistan or Bangladesh, tend to be poorer and less well educated than the average white family, studying postcodes and schools in this way will provide one not only with poor working class pupils, but often those who are black or whose families have their origin in parts of the Indian subcontinent. Those applicants who are placed at the University of Birmingham's medical school who fulfil these criteria are allowed in, with an A-level score of AAB rather than the AAA which everybody else is expected to get. It's not only Birmingham University's medical school, this practice has become widespread. I recently met up with two 18-year-old boys from a sixth form who are awaiting their results to see if they get into their chosen universities. They told me with amusement of the case of a fellow pupil who had received an offer from Oxford to study classics against all expectations because he's not particularly academic. The thing with Oxford is that they use GCSEs as well as predicted A-level results to decide whom to invite for interview and then offer a place to. It's a general rule at Oxford that unless you have practically all your GCSEs at A star, or 9 as it is now, then you needn't really bother applying there. The competition is that stiff. The boys to whom I spoke told me about a fellow pupil who achieved only 2 9s at his GCSEs and the rest were 7 and 8s, Not only was he invited to interview, he'd been offered a place at Oxford, which caused some surprise at their school. His name is Abdul, and he's a Nigerian, so both black and a Muslim, which is just what Oxford is after. The fellows who told me this were amused by it, although one was slightly less amused than the other, because he is himself Chinese and knows how this system militates against his own interests. It is to be hoped that now America is giving up this sort of awful practice, our universities might eventually follow suit.